Hello YouTube, I'm Jack Clark, TheYGOMusketeer, coming to you with another video. How are you? So, of course, today, as you can tell from the title of today's video, what I am showing you currently is a SeahorseWatts deck profile, an updated one, of course, since my last deck profile on this was pretty much my most viewed video on this channel. I thought I would do an updated version, simply because I can say without a shadow of a doubt, absolutely, this deck is significantly better than the previous deck in spades. It's much better. Of course, you may be thinking that and thinking quite skeptically, some of these card choices look a bit odd. Jack, what are you doing, you handsome devil? But okay, I will tell you, random viewer. Of course, first off, some of the choices do look a little bit suspect, but I will go into those in a moment. But before I go any further, let's go to the actual deck list itself. So, let's go to our monster lineup, which consists of 3 Thunder Seahorse, 3 Watt Cobra, 3 Watt Giraffe, and 3 Watt Pheasant. Really quite small monster lineup, but that's all we really need. Our spell card lineup is also rather small, with 1 Dark Hole, 1 Monster Reborn, 2 Mystical Space Typhoons, 2 Pot of Duality, and 3 copies of Swords of Revealing Light. Our traps make up the most of the deck, with 2 copies of Bottomless Trap Hold, 2 copies of Fiendish Chain, 3 copies of Magic Cylinder, 2 Mirror Forces, a Solemn Judgment, a Solemn Warning, 3 copies of Threatening Roar, 2 copies of Torrential Tribute, and 3 copies of Wabaku. Now, I would go into the extra deck, but honestly, the only card you need in your extra deck for Watts is Go 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 Cowboy. Honestly, this is the only card you should really be needing. You will have adequate protection, but if you don't have adequate protection, you can use Utopia. But if you do need it and your opponent's got an horrible monster on the field, you can use Paladynamo. Options are always good to have in a deck. Don't not use an extra deck because you don't think you need it. But honestly, if you can't get all of the extra deck cards, don't worry yourself. All you definitely need is Go 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 Cowboy. I have won so many games because I've attacked directly and then main phase 2, Go 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 Cowboy in defense mode for game. So, I've gone through the deck list, and now let's go through the actual deck and its choices. So, of course, as you can see, we've got a very small monster lineup. Compared to my previous build, in which I was using stuff like Marhunda and Tragodia, I've streamlined it slightly so I, of course, can focus on what I actually need. Because with this deck, you want to minimize dead draws. That's the reason why you're using this deck as opposed to, I don't know, a Hopper variant of Watts. You do not want to have dead draws. Every draw you have wants to be good. And, of course, you want to have some kind of high utility build to it. So this is why the monster lineup is so small. So, with it, you'll be just... Ideally, you'll be wanting to get your Thunder Seahorse as soon as possible. If you do get it early game, you're normally going to be set up for a good game. But if not, then you can work without it. But getting Seahorse really does help. It gets your pluses going. Of course, you send it from your hand to the you discard it to the you discard it. You don't need to send it to the grave. It can get banished easy, which is why this deck can easily side macro. You just get rid of it from your hand to add 2 light thunder monsters with 1600 attack or less, and of course they have to be level 4, which of course means that all the rest of your Watts are going to be eligible targets. However, you won't be just searching, you won't be just getting rid of 1 Seahorse for 2 copies of any one of these Watts. What you'll first be doing is, if you get it early game, depending on the cards in your hand, you'll ideally be getting rid of your Thunder Seahorse for 2 more Thunder Seahorse, and then those Thunder Seahorses will go towards the first one. Your first search after that will be for Watt Cobra, and the second will be Giraffe. Assuming that you haven't drawn multiple copies of those before you do that, you of course make different searches with your Seahorse for different things. The reason why you won't just search for one is because actually, although you won't get your Watts as soon as turn 1, you won't need them as soon as turn 1. To be fair, if you're going first, you won't be able to attack. But ideally, because it doesn't really matter either, because second turn you'll get your Cobras, which can search for every other Watt in your deck, including other copies of Cobra, and of course it can still search for the last copies of those cards, which of course Seahorse can't touch, because of course it needs to add 2 copies exactly of those monsters. So of course that's generally how the monster lineup works, and that's how you generally play it. The spell card lineup, of course, is slightly more interesting. Of course, with you will notice I'm not using Heavy Storm for obvious reasons. With such a big trap lineup, it gets in the way more than anything. But what you'll notice also is that I said that I was using a high utility build, and of course for a high utility build, really, Mystical Space Typhoon is not as optimal. I use Mystical Space Typhoon in this kind of deck because mainly in this kind of deck, you really don't care what your opponent's going to throw at you. I use Mystical Space Typhoon, though, because your opponent will use the odd card, which will screw you up monumentally. In some cases, your monster summon will be so important. That normal summon you use, you rely so much on. So if your opponent, I was just about to say bottomless trap holes, doesn't affect them. If your opponent manages to stop your monster's summon, I don't know, with a torrential tribute potentially, or with a bottomless trap, not bottomless trap hole, solemn warning. Again, I made the mistake. But if your opponent stops that normal summon, you will be sometimes in a quite dire position. So of course, being able to get rid of those options that your opponent will have before your opponent's able to make them is always good. Which is why I main at least 2 Mystical Space Typhoons in SeahorseWatts. I used to just side it completely, but that came back to bite me on the ass because I have had like game 1 against some people, especially Dark World, who will main Skill Drain, which is the bane of this deck's existence because it relies so much on the monster effects. Of course, the dualities are given as well because, well, you need to draw and get into those Thunder Seahorses. But in addition to that, the duality works so well with Thunder Seahorse because they both mean that you can't special summon on the turn you use them. Ideally, I would be using Card D. Card D I've kind of thought is a card that you don't really need in this kind of deck. Although it's a very nice option to have. It synergizes very well with the deck considering you can use duality, Card D, and Seahorse with your plentiful macro, and you'll be in a really good position for advantage. However, of course, if you draw into multiple copies of your Watts, you'll be in somewhat of a sticky situation, simply because you want your Seahorse to be able to search for those, and you don't want your Card Ds to draw them for you. So which is why, really, Card Ds are nice, but they're kind of a player preference thing. Now, the more interesting things in this deck, of course, will be the Swords of Revealing Light. Now, thinking behind this is that this is going to be one of those cards where your opponent is going to want to get rid of them as soon as possible. But in that case, you'll be thinking, why aren't you just using Messenger of Peace? Well, there are a couple of reasons. The main reason, of course, is the fact that, well, it's not the main reason, but one of the reasons, of course, is that, of course, the life point decreasing, you have to pay 100 points each turn, is kind of cumbersome. The life points, yes, are kind of inconsequential, but honestly, you will forget and you will get rule sharked. I do not want that to happen. But the main reason why I'm using Swords of Revealing Light is because of this. Well, I've figured out, and I've worked out, that when I was using Messenger of Peace, my opponent would focus so much of their advantage trying to get rid of it, that actually it wouldn't last 2 or 3 turns. And of course, with so many decks being able to just pop your back row, or just pop face-up cards, I mean, infantry is still a thing, and have MSTs in spades, then you will not have it on the field for too long. And of course, if you do have it on the field for more than 3 turns, and it does get destroyed by its own effect, then it's lived its usefulness. You would have protected your Watts for long enough. Because, of course, being able to protect your monsters from battle is the main thing in this deck. You want to protect your Watts for as much as you can. So I find that actually the 3-turn limit on Swords of Revealing Light is not really an issue at all. Another thing with the monster lineup, actually, before I go into the traps, is something very important. And this is a very common misconception with Watts. If the Watt deck you are using, or your opponent is using, doesn't focus on Hopper, then the most important card in the deck is not Cobra. I've seen so many people misplay and stop the summon of Cobra, and although I really shouldn't be saying this because actually it means that if anybody is watching this video and actually duel me in the future, then they will know that Cobra is not what you should be worried about. It is Watt Giraffe. Watt Giraffe is the ridiculous card in this deck. I can remember I had a duel with this against another Watt player, and he thought he was actually dueling really dirty. He wanted to have a duel against me, and he was maining Chain Disappearance because he wanted to have a mirror match, and he knew I would be using this. He used Chain Disappearance on my Watt Cobra, and I proceeded to 2-0 him with that duel, simply because I was able to better outplay him, utilising the effect of Watt Giraffe. Watt Giraffe, of course, when it attacks directly, does battle damage by a direct attack, then your opponent cannot activate any monster spells or traps until the end of the turn. It means all your other cards can get through, and all your other summons can get through, in addition to siding monster destruction like Smashing Ground and maybe Soul Takers. It means that you can destroy nigh on anything without your opponent being able to react. I mean, there's nothing quite like Smashing Ground or Stardust Dragon, am I right, folks? But yeah, now the video is getting a bit too long, so let's get to the trap lineup. So, of course, the trap lineup is pretty high utility. Like I said, this deck wants to have the minimum amount of dead draws as possible. So, of course, I would be using Veiler, but of course Veiler doesn't stop attacks like Fiendish Chain can. Fiendish Chain, of course, stopping attack is fantastic, and actually making sure there's a permanent negation on the field is stupidly useful, especially considering Ryo can screw up this deck monumentally. Of course, Watt's Pheasant can help with that as well, but Fiendish Chain means a more semi-permanent solution. In addition to that, if I have like Chain and Swords of Revealing Light, my opponent's really normally going to have to try and think about, oh, should I use my Mystical Space Typhoon on this or this? Of course, if they have the Heavy Storm, you have to still play conservative with this deck. I mean, you don't just set your entire back row. Notice how, although I do have chainable back row in the form of Roar and Rabaku, you will very rarely be setting more than one back row at a time, of course, for the fear of storm. Although, of course, you can chain your back row, you don't want to bait out the storm, because you don't really have the best ways to bait it out. So, of course, cards like Warnings, the Solemns, the Mirror Forces, Torrentials, Bottomlesses, they're pretty simple and really easy. The ones you really want to focus on, though, are the Threatening Roars and the Rabakus. Threatening Roar and Rabaku, of course, are really, they're staple in Watts, always have been. Roar you always use in Freeze, Rabakus has always been something that you use in aggressive forms of the Watt deck. So, with it, of course, being a chainable form of back row, it will protect all monsters on your side of the field from battle. To varying degrees, of course, Threatening Roar being better than Wabaku, simply because it can protect you from Catasta and Gladiator Beast. Gladiator Beast, of course, being one of this deck's worst matchups. Although, a funny story with that is that I went up against a Gladiator Beast player. He attacks, I use Magic Cylinder. He attacks again, I use Magic Cylinder the next turn. He attacks again, I use Magic Cylinder the next turn. Oh, did I mention that he Solemn Warnings a Watt Cobra previously in the duel? GG, bro, GG. So, yes, Wabaku and Threatening Roar, your opponent will be trying to get rid of your back row because that will be what you'll be mostly focusing on. And, of course, you can punish them for that by making so they can't attack at all. So that's good. And I did run 2 copies of Wabaku before. I always liked having 5 forms of tradable back row in my decks before. But I changed it up. I've maxed them both because, actually, it's never a dead draw. I mean, there's very rarely a point that I don't want to draw Wabaku or Threatening Roar, simply because, of course, it means I'm protected for a turn, and it's chainable. It's very, very rare that outside of end phase MST that this will ever be dead. The last card I want to talk about, of course, is Magic Cylinder. Magic Cylinder being one of those really, really quirky odd cards that is a good card, but no one uses it. The reason why I'm using it in this deck, of course, is the reason why you use it in, like, Burn or whatever, or you probably don't even use it in Burn because it's not chainable. This deck, you will side in between chainable back row and non-chainable back row often, very often. So Magic Cylinder is kind of a player preference choice. I like it simply because, like I said, with the Gladiator Beast player, I can use it, I can do damage, and the damage it can do is game-winning. And I had games where I have won due to Magic Cylinder. As dirty as those wins feel, it wins you games. You will be doing more damage per attack with your direct attacking Watts than any other monster in the game. Consistently anyway, of course. Attacks directly can do 1,000. Attacks directly does 1,200. Attacks directly does 1,000. Now, their 1,000 attack points or 1,200 attack points may not seem much on their own, but of course, like I said, that's the entire point of a Watt deck. They are weak, but those attack points go directly to your opponent's life points. And of course, 8 direct attacks and you win. So, that's pretty much it, guys. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any thoughts or ideas, or if you have any questions about the Watt deck itself, then do say in the comments down below as a video response. If you really do want to, I will put a typed out version of the deck list in the description down below, in addition to maybe a side deck choices and an extra deck, potentially. But of course, that is pretty much it. More videos coming to you in future. Of course, any ideas you have for future deck profiles or future videos are greatly appreciated. But until then, I'm Jack Clark, TheYGOMusketeer. More videos coming out to you soon. But until then, goodbye.